Welcome to the garden. This is my first attempt at a terrarium. And after 2 weeks we can see a bunch of new growth. I have 2 ferns, a bunch of mosses, and some ground covers. And I've chosen these because they're moisture-loving plants. This is basically sealed most of the day, so it keeps a lot of its moisture inside, which is perfect for ferns and mosses. It's absolutely beautiful. I recently did some modifications because my ferns are starting to sprout, and they look incredible, don't they? Those fiddleheads. I'm going to start removing plants from my terrarium because I really overplanted to compensate for any loss of plants, but I actually didn't lose a single plant. So I'm going to actually remove this semi-tropical vine, this pothos, and maybe a few of these dandelion seedlings. These were all just backups in case my ferns didn't sprout, but this fern is sprouting, and so is this one over here. Now, because I planted these out, I know where the roots are. And this one has one nice, really long root, but it's not very deep. So I'm just going to gently pull, try and leave all the soil and moss behind. There we go. So there's one. And I'll transplant this later in another pot. Now for the pothos. These things are so tough. I figured if anything survives, it's going to be this. But everything survived, so I'm actually going to pull it out now to leave more native plants. I'm also going to remove this large piece of lichen on a tree bark. Some of the other lichen started to mold, so I'm going to remove this ahead of time before it can mold. It did add a nice verticality to this pot, but now that my ferns are sprouting, those are really going to take over. And all these ground covers are starting to shoot up, so I really don't need that vertical feature anymore. Now, I'm going to pull some of these dandelion green sprouts. I planted these as a backup, but now they're really not necessary. But it's good to know that they'll sprout. So if nothing else, you could even find a dandelion flower and just plant the whole thing and have a little dandelion terrarium. I think I'm going to leave a couple. There's one over here, right in the center there, on the side, so I kind of want to see that. And to cover back up, I'm just going to poke around with this stick. So that looks okay. There is still some lichen in here that I'll leave, but I just wanted to remove that really large piece. Spread some spores around while we're at it. These are the tools I've been using. A stick is really handy. This is just a little piece of bamboo. I water with a spray bottle. It's really easy to control the amount you give it because you don't want to overwater. You can clean your leaves with a little moist Q-tip. That way you don't have to add additional water to the system. A little fork was really helpful for planting, and I use a scissors all the time. This is great for trimming dead debris. It also works as a sort of tweezers to pick up little bits. As long as you don't close the scissors completely. My little isopod must have been clinging on to one of these vines. So I'm going to toss him back in because I really like him in there as a little cleanup. I think these help out with mold and debris. So I'm just going to toss him back in. I've got my little isopod. Trying to look for an exit, but I hope he has enough food and water in here. I think he'll be okay. But he was just crawling around our basement, so I think he's better off in here. So now that I've removed a couple of the larger vines, I think it looks much more balanced, a little bit less cluttered, and most of these are now native plants, so they look really good together. But look at those fiddleheads. Those are just so beautiful. And we've kind of mimicked Earth with a layer of living plants on the surface, a substrate of soil, and then we have a layer of rock with charcoal at the base that acts as an aquifer. So any standing moisture down in the bottom is buffered by these rocks, so it's not absorbing up into the soil, which would just be oversaturation. Already we're starting to get some roots tapping down into the substrate, and we have charcoal mixed in just to purify any water that's down below. There's also charcoal mixed into the soil periodically just to keep any standing water pure. This kind of mimics the water cycle, the way it accumulates and then rains down back into the soil. So a little condensation is good. If you've got too much moisture, you can just wipe away some of this condensation with a nice clean towel, just so that you don't leave any stuff behind. But then that means you can view it much easier too. Because after all, these are a decoration. I set this up on a table under a lamp, and it was just like the most beautiful living sculpture. Ferns in a jar. It's like a little jar of spring. It can be really easy to overwater these. It's been 2 weeks and I've only watered that first time. I cleaned everything up, sprayed everything down, moistened everything, and I'm periodically keeping the lid off to evaporate extra moisture. I've got mine in a spot with really good morning sun and then bright ambient light for the rest of the day. And that seems to be working really well. Everything is just loving it. These ones here were actually cuttings, but because it's so moist in here, it's an ideal environment for rooting cuttings. This creeping Charlie is actually encroaching on the top of the jar. But I've picked these because they are low growing. They're not going to get much taller than this. And even if they do, I can trim them back. Normally you want to go for simplicity. Pick a couple different plants, maybe 1 or 2 varieties of moss. But I've gone with just everything I could find. Because it was winter and the ground was frozen, I wasn't sure which plants were going to take well to the transplant, but so far every single one is just thriving. So I really hope you give this a go. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.